Just to clarify, I don't hate The Promised Neverland. He said in his opening statement on the video where he tells everyone their favorite new show is bad. Okay, I realize that I'm kind of alone here, but I felt very underwhelmed by this first episode here, and I wanted to get into why. Partially to get them sweet seasonal anime views, partially to talk about the importance of making a good first impression, but mostly because the first episode is a big old plot twist that completely changes the tone and recontextualizes everything that happened before it, and thus has been compared to my favorite show ever a few times, and I don't know how to end this run-on sentence other than by saying, I think Gakkou Gurashi may have ruined the bait-and-switch episode 1 format for me. And look, I don't want to judge The Promised Neverland's first episode entirely by that standard, considering how highly I value that show. I don't think that's exactly fair. Also, these are very different shows with very different goals and ideas. While I will inevitably compare the two, I want to look at The Promised Neverland in a bubble first, because there's a lot that bothered me without even thinking about the comparison. From the very first scene, I got a massive warning flag. When characters talk to each other, there should be some clear goals, such as establishing what characters are like, explaining things the audience may need to know, expressing feelings, etc. But most importantly, it should be able to do these things in others while sounding natural. Meaning, characters shouldn't lazily dump exposition or point out things that other characters would already be aware of. Strangely enough, this is an issue that seems worse in the anime adaptation. I looked into the manga after finishing this first episode, and I found that a lot of this dialogue, not all of it, but a lot, was narrated by Emma, while the anime decides to have its characters say things like, It would make more sense for Emma to be telling the audience a story through internal dialogue, as it would present us with important information while allowing the characters to interact in a way that feels more human. Oh my god, it sounds like that was the initial intention or something. Speaking of things that were changed for bad or no reasons, the opening scene is actually a flashback that in the manga arises when Emma and Norman talk about the fence they're not allowed to cross. I'm assuming this scene is at the beginning to grab the viewer or something, but it's not that interesting. It sort of ruins the build-up throughout the whole episode, considering it begins lighthearted only to eventually turn dark otherwise. If people on Twitter screaming for no one to spoil the show didn't already clue you into the fact that this first episode has a dark twist. By the way, great job guys, you really saved everyone from being spoiled. But even if that didn't clue you in, I'm sure this very first scene may just do that. It sure did for me. Not only does this scene sort of ruin the build-up, it's also just completely pointless as the exact same lines of dialogue are used at the fence with the same exact characters. Just do what the damn manga did! It's already there and it works better! By the way, I'm not giving the manga a complete pass as it shares a lot of these issues. However, it seems that the anime cranked these problems up to 11 for seemingly no reason. Like, why did you change the part with Connie and her bunny? The changes didn't add anything and instead actively took away the one character trait she had besides nice and child. But alright, let's take a step away from these anime to manga differences for a moment. I feel like for a first episode that goes for the twist, it's oddly establishing its dark tone too much while simultaneously going overboard on its lighter tones to the point where it feels hollow and fake. Connie was waving death flags the entire time and they didn't give her any character that would make her worth keeping around. It's like she wanted to die so much so that it would give the average college student a run for their money. Foreshadowing is important, but if you want your twist to work, you have to hide details well enough, set up red herrings, and leave a lot ambiguous. But everything is just so blatant, and it's incredibly unsubtle. Every character sells their happy life so hard, and the music shifts the tone so aggressively that nothing is shocking. The expository dialogue not only feels unnatural, but it's also only there to inform the viewer that something bad will happen.
手紙？ほら、ハウスを出て行って誰一人よこさないじゃない。みんなのこと絶対忘れない。私ハウスを出たらママみたいなお母さんになるの。それでね、絶対に子供を捨てたりしないの。
I can hear the rusty and clanking gears behind the scenes trying to make me feel something. I can't ignore it because nothing in this episode feels real. It's all mechanical. The setting is pretty lifeless, the characters are pretty flat and don't communicate like humans, the music and sound design is overly dramatic and leaves little doubt in the viewer's mind. But look, this is actually not entirely a problem of the Promised Neverland. Anime horrors and thrillers tend to forget or ignore how effective subtlety and ambiguity can be. That or their attempt at accomplishing this can often fall short. We get a lot of harsh music cuts and crazy faces, not to mention the over-the-top gore and reliance on shock value. And I'm not entirely opposed to this sort of presentation, but if done wrong, it takes away from things like tension, speculation, anxiousness, dread, etc. I think the issue is that it's a fine line between giving too much information and not giving enough. And the reason this comparison to Gakkou Gurashi's fake-out first episode kind of bothers me is that while I feel The Promised Neverland almost doesn't try walking this fine line, Gakkou Gurashi most definitely did, and I think will be remembered more fondly despite it existing in a much less popular series. Gakkou Gurashi does not run into any of these problems, while also being much more densely packed with foreshadowing. This first episode is also a fantastic example of how you can set up an effective twist. The opening scene manages to raise questions without presenting anything that would be perceived as dark or unsettling. Like, why does Yuki sleep in the school? Why is there a dog allowed in the school? Why is the paper taped over the sign? Even things you wouldn't normally question in a normal slice of life show act as foreshadowing. It's literally hiding its details in plain sight. Also, we learn enough about Yuki's character in the opening minute and 40 seconds in a natural way. She's not very responsible and will oversleep. She's outgoing. She likes cute attire. She loves her school. Also, the one line that wouldn't sound natural is stated internally and is more of a narration.
Wait a minute, I think I'm remembering something I said earlier.
This leads to the OP, which compared to the Promised Neverland's OP, works with the tone it's attempting to set. The Promised Neverland's OP is this loud, poppy electronic song from Overworld playing alongside some slightly dark imagery with determined and angry looking characters. I think this OP is fine, but including it in the first episode works against the show trying to come off as something more lighthearted. Another thing actively working against the twist it's trying to set up. Gakkou Gurashi's OP is a more chipper, upbeat song coupled with cutesy imagery that manages to hide details within it, simultaneously matching the tone of the first scene and the following scenes, while also having details within it that raise more questions, like, why does this purple Hatsune Miku have a shovel? The rest of the cast also express elements of their personalities through actions and how they interact with one another. This includes the dog, who has more of a personality than Connie did. The first time the music and sound design create a tone shift is something the show manages to hold back from doing for about 11 minutes. It's nothing more than a long amount of natural silence, followed by the blowing of wind, Toromaru's barking off in the distance with a bit of reverb, and the tune of a distant school bell as Yuki passes by a broken window that's on screen for about a second. The sounds of everything fade and it cuts to commercial. Notice how things are communicated without it being blunt? The creepy music is just the school bell, which is something that would be integrated into the setting itself. It's something that feels off, but we can't determine what the implication is just yet. It's something one may even not notice or shrug off. What's important here is that when combined with the visual of the broken window, we may assume something is wrong, but can't pinpoint exactly what it is. Compare it to the scene in The Promised Neverland that pans past the branded numbers on the necks of all the children. One issue is that this isn't the first time we see the numbers on their necks. If one were paying attention, they would already be aware of these numbers and question it. So when the show pauses for a moment and forces you to stare at these numbers as loud, creepy music plays, it's reinforcing information you're already aware of, probably, while also blatantly communicating that it's a bad thing. This is also something we're shown about 2.5 minutes after the OP. We barely have any time to speculate about this before the show cuts to ominous music and bluntly communicates "thing bad." The problem is that it's the show telling you how to feel instead of subtly manipulating you into feeling a certain way and questioning things. It's the difference between someone telling you that you should feel scared instead of someone making you feel scared by telling you a scary story. Same end goal, but there's a reason the first option does not work. Now I want to talk about spoilers and why they don't matter to me nearly as much as others. However, I will not be spoiling the twist of either of these shows, just out of respect. It's because of Gakkou Gurashi's first episode that I decided spoilers don't matter to me, as the twist in this first episode was my introduction to the series, and it's still effective despite me being spoiled. It's because it was well made and has value beyond its shock. And I have no issue with shock value as a gimmick, but there needs to be substance supporting it. The Promised Neverland was something I went into blind, and I find very little value in this first episode beyond it being an introduction. The first episode of The Promised Neverland is something that you will never need to revisit after seeing it once. Beyond its twist and the details that are literally spelled out in subtitles, there's nothing I find all that enjoyable, interesting, or worth analyzing in this episode. You can say things like the directing is good, it has an interesting premise, it has a sense of tension, and I wouldn't completely disagree, but I have seen all of these things done much better. When I look back at The Promised Neverland's first episode, I only find problems, most of which are due to the adaptation changing almost nothing about the first chapter while also stretching it out to fit in a 22-minute time span. Based on this first episode, my predictions for how I will feel about the show once it's finished will likely be something akin to very interesting premise with an unsettling atmosphere. I was disappointed that it was used for shock value rather than theming or psychology. It was too underdeveloped for my taste, but still an entertaining popcorn series. Oh wait, that's Alexander's review for Gakkou Gurashi. I wonder what he thinks of The Promised Neverland.
I want to fuck